For this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about fictional courses, not so much fantasy, but fictional ones built on real terrain. And there are a few ways to go about this. It's, of course, much easier if you have LiDAR already to start with. And so that's what this is going to focus on, using LiDAR of terrain, real land, and finding a course. I'm going to talk about overhead image creator a little bit, and then as well as mostly I'm going to talk about alternatively using Blender to do some of the larger shaping and things like that, using a new shader method, using a topology viewable shader, and then how you could go back and forth between terrain in Unity, the terrain object, which you would export to Blender, and then going back, if you needed to, going back to Unity terrain and conforming that, just a workflow or some options for how to kind of bounce back and forth between Unity and Blender doing terrains, as well as ways to plot the course. So this is my terrain to start. This is a course that's already nearly complete, actually, but I just kind of discovered this method and I thought I'd go over it. So you could do any shaping you needed to here, in the same way you would do anything else. You could use the overhead image creator and texture painting to map out holes. So for instance, if I'm over here and I'm thinking, gosh, this is a nice spot for a green site. So what you could do, in the terrain textures, and this is stuff probably a lot of people already know, you could add a texture. For instance, these are just green swatches. They're not even material or anything. They're just literally just a green square. So, but I could add a couple different ones. Probably all you'd really need would be a fairway and a green kind of thing to kind of get your shapes. So what you do is you would select one and then get your brush size. You go, okay, I'd like to use, this is where I think a green site could go, and you're kind of looking at terrain. Then you could select this one and say, paint. You can kind of see. Anyway, this is how a lot of people would do a fictional course, right? You would go through, you could alter the elevations if you felt like you needed to. You can go, you could go back and paint out, back to the regular satellite. And then, your top-down view, you would use the overhead image creator to export that, and that's what you would use for doing splining and things like that, right? Now, as far as doing elevation work and plotting out holes, that can also be done just by hand. Either you could do it with Photoshop or any other software like that, and you could use topology maps. That's the way it's done, so I've been told, by by the real guys who do this in the real world. Jackson Kahn and a lot of the other architects work from topology maps, not necessarily currently in game engines, although maybe that's changing. So let me show you Blender, and let's talk about this new shader that can print. It can render topology maps, and you can use those in the flow. So what you would do is you would export your terrain to object, just like you would do if you were doing splining, and then you would bring that into Blender. So let's bounce over to Blender and we'll take a look. So once you've imported your terrain, import terrain, this is your terrain. Now, what you would do if you didn't have any holes laid out, or what you could do, is you could take your plot size, set up an Inkscape, and instead of drawing holes, you could just fill the space and send it online to the Blender for cut and mesh, and you could just mesh out anything. It could just be a giant fill shape, one big plot of rough. Just fill this outer, or you could draw anything just to generate just some meshes that'll get you a file, and then you would import your terrain into that. When terrain is imported, it's hidden, but it's in your list. So you'd see it in your list. This particular file does not have any spline meshes, but you might have a whole list of spline meshes, but the terrain will be there, it'll just be hidden. If you unhide it, it's going to look something like this, right? And then the interesting thing is, it's a mesh. Your terrain object is a mesh just like the spline meshes are. It's the same thing. If you unhide it and you tab into face mode or to vertex mode or whatever, you're going to see that it's just a giant mesh. That's all it is, right? And it's being used to be conformed to once you have holes splined, but the object itself is not different. So it's hard to work with simply because it's enormous and dense. You can see just how dense it is. So it takes a lot of computer power to play with the whole thing at once, which is why it's broken into smaller meshes, or part of the reason. But we can alter this in Blender the same way that we can alter meshes, right? There's no reason that you can't. So what we have now, if you watch my other video about setting up, link below, how to set up a shader so that you have your satellite view, we can now also set up a shader that DP made a shader that does topology, and I have modified it so that you can also mix and overlay the satellite view at the same time. So you're going to see, if I go to up here to my viewport shading and I change it from just solid to the actual material preview, you're going to see that now we have topology lines, right? So this is actually a 1 foot topology, and it is dynamic in real time. And if I go into the shader, so if I look at my shading viewport, and we look at what we have here, we can turn on, I've added the sat shader into this one, we can turn this on, and now we have not just the topology lines, but we have, you can kind of see, we have the sat shader in here. And I'll include this file to download. You can actually go in here and you can alter, this is the contour lines. You can go in here and you can alter things like the interval. I guess right now we're at a half, so we could set that to 1 foot, and then you can see if we change it to 1 foot, they're a little farther spaced apart. I was actually at 6 inch. We have our line thickness here, so if it feels a little too much, we can dial that back in there. And it's in a multiply value, and so you can also drag back and forth. Oh, whoops, that's the wrong one. Sorry, you do not want that one. You want here, emission. So you would want to do, let's see, this should change. Yeah, so this is going to change the color of your lines, and it can be whatever you want it to be. You could have the lines be black. I feel like white shows up a little better. If it's a little too harsh, you can dial it down, and you can, either one is going to adjust the strength. That's the same as using grayscale there. So those are the things that can alter your view. Now, as far as actually playing with this, like I said, it's dynamic. Because this is a huge mesh, the terrain object is one huge item, your computer is really going to bog down if you try to go into vertex mode. It's going to take a second to even bring that up because it's just so many. I mean, it's a 8 million triangle mesh, and so you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to adjust things. So I'm not even going to try, but if I were to try and grab and move this, it's going to really chug. But one thing I've discovered is there is a really cool way to do this with sculpt mode that works dynamically and doesn't seem as resource intensive. So you could go up to either the sculpting workflow, or you can just change this to sculpt in your layout. And I'm not going to do like a tutorial on sculpting here. I'm not amazing at it myself. I don't know everything about it, but there's plenty of things on YouTube to teach you. But you really don't need too much. This is going to work very similar to the way terrain manipulation and digging in Unity work. You can use the standard draw. You have things like your radius, which is the size of your brush. The F key is going to allow you to, you hit F and then you just drag your mouse and it will change, and you click to resize it. And then you have your strength. So that's basically going to be the same as opacity strength in Unity terrain movement. And then do you want plus or minus? Are you going to add to your terrain, or are you going to remove terrain? So watch what happens now. If I take a big brush here, I'm going to turn my strength down a bit. Watch what happens as I adjust this mound. Right now I'm pushing the mound down, right? Or I can change it and I can add and make it larger. I can change my strength and it'll happen faster. I can change my brush size. And you can see that everything about this is happening in real time. It is showing me topology map changes in real time, right? I'm gonna break in here. This is recorded a little later. I realized I didn't show another cool thing. If we go back into the shader, before we're making any changes, if we look at what it's pulling, I showed that it's pulling my satellite view, right? That's what we're getting from our overlays is the satellite. But what we can do is we can use any image we want there. So if we've already splined some holes, we can find the spline overlay. And if we already have mapped out some holes, we can throw that over the top, and that might give us the ability to see exactly where we want to make elevation changes and things like that. And we can generate these images that we use as our satellite overlay any way we want to. We can use our Inkscape file like I have here. If we're at an earlier stage, we're still discovering holes, we can use the overhead image creator that we've exported from Unity, where we've painted holes like I showed at the beginning. Or if we're working from a topo map that we've already just drawn out holes on, like we maybe would in Photoshop or something like that, we can even use something like a sketch. So this is just a Photoshop file that I just put a layer over the top of my satellite, and I drew out where I kind of wanted holes. So you can use this in the whole process, and you can swap these images whenever you want, as long as they are all the same dimensions, which is your terrain size. And that allows us to pretty much use any overlay we want and choose where and see better where we want to make our terrain changes like that. Sorry I didn't show that. I'll be quiet now and let myself get back to the rest of the stuff. Now the cool thing is, once you've splined and you have meshes in here, you can still just conform through the OPCD tools the exact same way. You can hide your terrain and bring up your meshes, have your meshes visible again. And you can go to conform meshes, and you can conform to whatever changes you have sculpted in Blender, just like you could conform it after a straight import, even though you're making alterations in Blender instead of Unity. Now, to go back and forth with that, you can also then send your mesh files, once you export FBXs back into Unity, then you would use the lower terrain script to conform your terrain. So let's bounce back over there and take a look at that. So back in Unity, I've turned on my meshes like I lower mesh, terrain under meshes, is going to look name-wise. So it's looking for spline path name. If you take your if you take And like I said, it's just a mesh. You can rename that. You can hit F2, or you can make a duplicate of it if you don't want to change. It needs to be called terrain to do the conform. But you could also make a duplicate or rename it to anything, like you can name it spline path terrain. You could select it and then export that, and you could drag that into your scene. And I think I did that. I think it's really cool, this topology. And then the other thing you can do with this script that will be part of the file I link below is you can actually render a image of your terrain. And you can do that either at any time. You can do it right away. So you can take your base LiDAR terrain object, just throw on this contour line shader, and you can render that out. You can throw that into Photoshop or use it as your background in Inkscape to draw your holes on. Or you can do it later, and you can even use that as a sat overlay in Unity if you want to, just to see the same view in Unity if you prefer working there. So let's take a look at how we do that. So what you do is you can either pull out a scripting window, so you would go up here until your cursor changes, drag out, and pull up over here a text editor, which is your script window. Or you can go to scripting, and you're going to see down in the scripting tab here that there's already, in this file, there's this script, the contour lines ortho camera render. And what you would do is you look for the play button, and what that's going to do is it's going to give you a window to save, and you would name the file. So I named mine Farm Topo Overhead, and then you delete the blend. So and it's going to save it as a PNG file. That's what this script is going to do. And what that's going to render is, it's going to render this right here. It depends on how you have your shader set up though. So actually, the reason this looks like this is when I rendered it, I had, if you remember in the shading, you can actually click on, for instance, this is the image, Lake Valley MN overhead. And again, to set up this sat shader portion, you can watch this other video, it's linked below. The one thing that's very important is this needs to be your terrain size right here. So this is your terrain size, and then the image you use would be any of your sat overlays. But what you can also do, and what I would do if you're going to use this in Photoshop as part of your overhead, is you can actually turn this off by hitting the M key, which mutes that. So now it's a black background instead of the image. And then it will, I opened the PNG that it rendered, I found that location, I opened it in Photoshop, and now we have this overhead. You might need to rotate it 180 degrees because what I did was I copied and pasted this rendered PNG. This water stuff is actually part of this Photoshop file. Because what I did is I copied, this was the rendered image, and I pasted it into a Photoshop file that includes my regular, this is the LiDAR sat overlay, right? So, And the reason I'm doing it rendered without the satellite is because it's more flexible. If I paste this into my Photoshop document, I can do layer effects on this to change it to whatever I want. And then I can have a better control over how it's viewed, right? So I think I had the lines a bit thicker when I rendered this. It's maybe too thick to see real well, but this is, I think, a 6-inch render, not a 1-foot render. But like I said, you can change any of those options. You can paste it in over the top of your sat, and then you can either save this out and then use that as your Inkscape background. You can combine it with an overhead image creator from Unity to draw out your holes that way. I have experimented with trying to texture paint my holes in Blender, which is basically the same thing as when we were drawing over here, the very first part of this video. We're chugging. What are we stuck on? So it was and let's turn this back on. When we were drawing on here, that's basically texture painting, and I was trying to do that in Blender as well, but because it's an 8 million try count mesh object in Blender, it wasn't working well. It's just not practical. Blender doesn't excel at something that large. So if you want to plot your holes out using some form of texture paint, I would still do it in Unity this way. But you could take that overhead image creator from your drawn out, you could layer that in Photoshop on top of this, and then you could adjust layers however you wanted to for visibility. You could then throw that into Inkscape to map out your holes and things like that. And you can also use this method even after you've got all your holes done to fine-tune things. You can go in, do all of that. Well, let's turn this back on, M. You could even, once your holes were laid out and you had a whole list of splines, let's see, do I have that one up? Yeah, so here's my spline version, and that's the same area here, right? And I could hide those. I could find my terrain is at the bottom here. There's my terrain, right? Now, this is just my regular file that came from Blender. You can see there isn't that shader in here, the one that gives me the topo. So how do we get that in there? Well, that's actually pretty easy. If you've downloaded the file that's in this video, then you would go to File, Append, and where I am here, you can see it. You'd go to the Topo Camera and Sculpt Sat. That's the name of the Blender file. Go into Materials, and then you would select the Contour Line Shader. That's the shader we built in that other file. And once we add that, then it will show up in this list right here. And then we can add it to it and turn it on. There you go. So now that is part of the file that has all of our hole meshes in it. And if we wanted to, we could then go in sculpting, and we can make any, where are we? We lost our placement. Okay, so then we can go in here and we can make any changes we want to make to our terrain. And then we can still go in and we can do conform, because you can just reconform things whenever you want. So now we've altered our terrain, even though we have all of our holes in there, and we could conform our meshes to that. So we don't even have to go to Unity and re-export the object. We can make the changes to the terrain in basically the same way right inside Blender, and then just conform on the fly. And then once we push those back into Unity, then we use the lower terrain script to make it all the same. One other thing you can do, you can assign the contour material to any mesh. It doesn't have to be on the terrain mesh. So I was saying that I prefer using the sculpt tools just because going into edit mode on the entire terrain is too hard on a machine because it's millions of tries. But if you, for whatever reason, if you wanted to do it on individual meshes using just the standard stuff I've showed before, just moving around stuff, you could assign the material there if you really want to see the contours for some reason while you're doing it. So you could just select anything and add the shader to it. We'll just do these two here, probably. But just remember that this is going to just be a stat view. So if you were to do it to all of your meshes, your holes are sort of going to disappear. You're just going to see your satellite. So unless you've already created like a fake fairway satellite, you're not going to see the definition of your holes anymore. Remember to change to material preview, and then just like before, you've now got your contour lines on the meshes that you've assigned that material to, right? So if you wanted to do it that way, and then you would be able to go into select, like all the other videos I've showed, you could select all these meshes around here if you wanted to, and you can select in any way and do any kind of operations you want. And you'll see, like I'm moving this up and down, and you're seeing the contour lines moving, right? And you're not going to see the lines move on your fairway because that's not where your material is assigned. But anywhere, like you got a dip right here, so anywhere you wanted to do this kind of stuff, and there's, you're cutting that dip in farther, making a hole. Maybe you don't want it to be a hole like that, so you move that up. You can see it's not. Maybe you want to create this over here, so you're not going to see the lines anywhere you didn't assign the material, but you can still use the old methods of any kind of modification on the terrain. In edit mode, I would just suggest doing it on a smaller mesh basis like that. You just can't get away with it on the giant terrain all at once. And while you can do any of those things and use this in conjunction with any method of modifying the meshes, this really is, excuse me, this really is a semi-replacement or alternate to terrain work in Unity. I would not suggest trying to pair it with things like very specific detail work like bunker lips, things like that. This is meant for large scale changes to see where things flow and do that kind of thing, and just kind of a cool trick for some people. So while I wouldn't use it for that detail work, it does kind of give you an alternate flow for how we do terrain stuff, the big movements and things like that in Unity. And while there's back and forth, it might actually be quicker if you are just doing most of your work in Blender and just conforming as you go and then going back to terrain and stuff. And then, of course, bringing your meshes, whether that's your terrain mesh or your hole meshes or some fake ones you made, just to bring into Unity while you're laying out holes. We want to conform that stuff in Unity using the lowering script, and just to make sure our terrain in Unity matches whatever we did in Blender, because that's kind of what we use for most of our planting, and that's why. So hopefully this gave you some ideas, and please feel free to let me know if there's better ways to do this. I never pretend to know everything about this, and I'm always just experimenting. Good luck. Okay, I hope I touched on everything. I kind of went fast, but I also feel like I repeated myself a bit. But I wanted to show some of the alternate workflows and another way that you can use Blender to do some things in a similar way, but perhaps even more precise, because you have the options of using so many different tools down here. You can learn sculpting, smoothing. They have a lot of the same tools and even more. The one thing I will say is it's not going to work as precisely as a lot of my other videos on bunkers and bunker lips and things like that. That stuff's still going to have to be done on a mesh by mesh basis. It's changes that small. And remember that no matter where you're doing your large elevation changes, anytime you conform to terrain, you're going to lose those details. So this is still part of that initial shaping and kind of whole layout stage. But it gives you a really good option for some pretty precise and very visually fun ways to see what you're changing, and it's just kind of cool to see the elevations that way. So hopefully that gives you yet more options for how to do fictional courses and even some real coursework. Thanks.